So in my last video, I tested out the brand new Sigma 150 to 600mm f5 to 6.3 DGDN OS Sport, and as it turns out, it's a pretty damn good lens. However, this week I want to see how this lens stands up against its closest rivals, namely the Sony 200 to 600mm f5.6 to 6.3, the Sony 100 to 400mm f4.5 to 5.6 G Master, and the Tamron 150 to 500mm f5 to 6.7. The Sony 200 to 600mm lens is the longest and heaviest lens of the bunch, though it does have a slight excuse for being this large and heavy, and that's down to the fact that it's able to zoom internally. Basically, all this means is that when you rack from 200mm to 600mm, the lens remains the same size, which makes it slightly smoother and quicker to operate. The downside, of course, is that this makes the lens harder to store in your camera bag as it takes up a lot more room than its competitors. As for weight, although the Sony 200 to 600mm is the largest lens, it's actually not that much heavier than the Sigma, which is only a couple of grams lighter. The Tamron is around 240 grams lighter than these big boys, mainly due to its smaller stature, shorter zoom range, and also because it's predominantly made from hard plastics, as opposed to the other lenses that all favour a largely metal construction. The Sony GM is the lightest lens by far and is almost a kilogram lighter than the Sigma and the other Sony. The main reason for the GM being so light is that it has a significantly shortened zoom range compared to the others, only stretching from 100mm to 400mm. The Tamron has a marginally improved range of 150 to 500mm, with the other Sony in third place with a 200 to 600mm zoom. The Sigma has the longest zoom range of them all, spanning from 150 to 600mm. The other difference between these lenses is their maximum apertures. Now, all of these lenses have a variable maximum aperture, meaning that as you zoom in, the maximum aperture will get smaller and let in less light. The Sony GM is the fastest lens of the bunch with a maximum aperture range of f4.5 to 5.6. Next is the Sigma with a range of f5 to 6.3. The Tamron's aperture starts at f5 but closes down to 6.7 at the long end, whereas the cheaper Sony starts at f5.6 but offers a maximum aperture of 6.3 at the long end. So this does make things slightly more confusing because the Tamron is technically faster at the short end, whereas the cheaper Sony is able to shoot at a wider maximum aperture of f6.3 at the long 600mm end. Anyway, all of these lenses come with a lens collar attached so that you can mount them directly to a tripod or monopod. The foot on the Sony lenses can be unscrewed and removed entirely if you want to narrow the profile of the lens whilst transporting it around, whilst the lens collar on the Tamron can be removed entirely. The Sigma is kind of the odd one out here because the lens collar cannot be easily removed, and although the foot can be taken off, you do need to unscrew 4 bolts on the base plate to do that, which isn't really a quick process. One thing I do really like about the Sigma's lens collar, however, is that you can very easily loosen it using a large thumb screw and rotate it from landscape to portrait orientation, and at each position it firmly clicks in place to ensure that you're at a perfect 90-degree rotation. Now, although the lens collars on the other lenses can be loosened and rotated in exactly the same way, the big difference is that they don't have a click when you hit the 90-degree angles, and that means that you instead have to carefully line up the dot markers by sight, which is arguably a lot slower and less accurate. One final thing I should mention before we move on is that the Sigma and Tamron lenses both have a foot that's compatible with most Arca Swiss tripod heads, meaning that it can slide straight into your compatible tripod or monopod without the need to fix on a plate at the bottom, whilst the Sony lenses do not include this feature straight out of the box. Okay, so in terms of buttons and switches, the lenses are all very similar. They all include an MF to AF switch and a focus limiter switch. All of these lenses come with optical image stabilisation built in, so there's also switches to turn this on and off, as well as cycling through the various stabilisation modes that they offer. The Sigma has a switch for changing between the 2 custom modes that allows you to further personalize the lens performance by using Sigma's USB dock. Both of the Sony lenses and the Sigma have 3 customizable AF lock buttons located at the 12, 6 and 9 o'clock positions on the lens barrel to allow you to easily access them no matter which orientation the camera is shooting in. The Tamron, however, does not have any customizable buttons. With lenses this big and heavy, lens creep can be a real issue, but luckily all of these lenses have a solution to that problem. Starting with the Sigma, this lens has a lock switch with 3 different modes. L keeps the lens locked in place while fully retracted. T increases the resistance on the zoom, making it harder to rotate, but also helps to prevent lens creep when the lens is tilted up or down. And S mode offers the least amount of resistance, allowing it to function more like a standard zoom lens. The Tamron has a lock switch for keeping it fixed in place at the short end. Like the Sigma, it also has 2 levels of zoom smoothness, but rather than using a conventional switch, you instead increase the torque on the zoom by pushing the zoom ring forward. To deactivate this, you simply pull the ring back again, and I actually found this method super intuitive and quick to use. The Sony G Master doesn't have a lock switch, but it does include both a smooth and tight mode, which can be toggled between by rotating a small ring just behind the zoom ring. The Sony 200 to 600mm obviously doesn't need a lock switch because its internal zoom mechanism means that lens creep just isn't a problem. The only lens creep that this thing has is the guy behind the camera using the 600mm end of the zoom to spy on his neighbours, if you know what I mean. I should also mention that with the exception of the Sony 200 to 600mm, these zooms can be operated by either twisting the zoom ring or by pushing and pulling the front element of the lens. Obviously with the Sony 200 to 600mm, pushing and pulling isn't an option due to its internal zoom mechanism. The only pushing and pulling done with this lens is the pervert behind the lens tugging on his man meat while spying on his neighbours, if you know what I mean. On that strangely reminds me that all of these lenses are built with a splash and dust-proof construction, including rubber O-rings around the lens mount to help prevent any nasties from getting inside your camera body. Splash-proof, if you know what I mean. When switching over to manual focus, all of them operate nice and smoothly, and despite them all being focused by wire, they're surprisingly accurate and quick to react to varying focusing speeds. So when it comes to handing out points for price, the Sigma is the cheapest option here in the UK, whereas you can actually pick up the Tamron on Amazon for about $100 less in the US. So I think it's only fair to award both of these lenses a point in this round. When it comes to build, all of them deserve a point in my opinion because they're all fantastically made, but when it comes to handling, I'm going to give the point to the Sony G Master as it's small, lightweight, and I just generally found that it was the nicest lens to use for any long period of time. When it comes to autofocus, in good lighting conditions, all of these lenses are rapid to focus with no signs of hunting. In low light conditions, all of these lenses slowed dramatically and would take a while to lock onto their target, but they were still totally usable and none of them really hunted wildly out of control. And in fairness, if you're going to be shooting in low light conditions often, then these lenses probably aren't the best choice for that, as they're really not designed to shoot in anything other than bright daylight. But the fact that they can cope with low light situations like this is only a bonus. When shooting wide open in high speed continuous mode, all of these lenses did a great job of keeping up with fast moving targets, with the vast majority of the shots I captured being sharp and in focus. So with the results in this round being very closely matched, all of these lenses deserve a point apiece. When shooting a moving target in video mode, all of these lenses managed to keep locked onto the subject whilst filming with no signs of hunting. When it comes to AF noise, the Tamron and the Sony 200 to 600mm just don't make any noise at all. The Sigma and the Sony G Master are also very, very quiet, though if you do listen carefully, you can hear a very subtle purring noise that was picked up by our camera's built-in microphone. As I've already mentioned, all of these lenses feature built-in optical stabilisation, which can be paired with the in-body image stabilisation found in most of Sony's mirrorless cameras to further combat against camera shake when shooting handheld. I found that the Tamron produced the best results of the bunch, which is also helped by the fact that this lens is fairly lightweight and small. If I was really splitting hairs, I would have to say that the Sony 200 to 600mm was probably the worst performer, but I honestly believe that that's likely due to the fact that it's noticeably bigger, heavier, longer, and therefore harder to handhold for longer periods of time. None of these lenses suffer from any major amounts of focus breathing, which is definitely good news for videographers. At a push, I would say that the Tamron is probably the worst offender, but in my opinion, it's really not enough to write this lens off entirely if this type of thing really bothers you. With another very even performance in this round of testing, it's points across the board for all of these lenses once again. When it comes to bokeh, obviously you're not going to get a super thick blur like you would with a faster zoom lens like a 70 to 200 f2.8 for example, but that's because the trade-off here is that you get a much longer zoom range without it having to weigh the same as a small car. Now, if you are interested in a super long, super fast lens, then you'll definitely need to lay down $25,000 for the Bigma, but More about that in the link at the top of the screen. But anyway, despite this, the bokeh quality of all these lenses is still pretty nice and smooth, so you won't be disappointed with any of these options. In our bokeh balls test, the results were all very similar, round circles in the center that turn into misshapen orbs towards the edges of the frame. Now, seeing as the results are once again too close to call an overall winner, I'm going to award all 4 lenses a point in this round. All of these lenses cope with flaring pretty well, though interestingly, the Sony G Master produces the most noticeable artifacts, which may or may not be a good thing depending on whether you like that type of thing or not. Either way, flaring really shouldn't be a problem with any of these options because they all come packaged with a large lens hood that does a really good job of sheltering the front element from bright sunlight. Shooting wide open at the short end of these lenses, they all exhibit some pin cushion distortion, with the Tamron being the worst offender and the Sony G Master having the least amount of distortion. Zooming into the center, the Sony G Master provides the sharpest results overall, with the cheaper Sony 200-600 in second place, followed by the Tamron and the Sigma, which are tied for third. Despite a tiny touch of magenta fringing on the Sony 200-600mm, all of these lenses provide a lovely amount of contrast with no major chromatic aberration issues. At the corners, the G Master is still razor sharp, closely followed by the Sigma and the cheaper Sony in joint second place. The Tamron produces the worst corner sharpness with a very soft and smudgy result overall. Switching to the long end while still shooting wide open, pin cushion distortion is still unfortunately present in all of the lenses. When you zoom into the middle of the chart, the Sony G Master is still the sharpest of the bunch, very closely followed by the cheaper Sony and the Tamron in joint third place. Unfortunately, the Sigma is left in fourth place as it produces a very marginally softer image compared to the other lenses, however it is still a very sharp lens. At the corners is incredibly close and very hard to call an overall winner, as all of them now display excellent sharpness, though if I was being super critical, I would have to say that the Sigma is a fraction softer than the rest. Shooting at the minimum focusing distance at the shortest end of these lenses, the Sigma and the Tamron are able to focus a lot closer than either of the Sony lenses. The Sony G Master, Sigma and Tamron are all very sharp, whilst the Sony 200-600mm lags behind a bit with a marginally softer result accompanied by some blue fringing. Switching over to the longer end of the zooms, the Sony G Master and the Tamron are now able to focus the closest, and in terms of sharpness, the two Sonys are in first place, with the Sigma and Tamron in joint second. On our longitudinal chromatic aberration test, the Sony G Master and the Sigma lenses provided the best results. The Sony GM had a small amount of amber fringing at the top of the frame, with magenta fringing at the bottom of the frame. The Sigma's results were even more subtle. If you kind of squint a bit, you can kind of pick out a touch of green fringing at the top and a bit of red fringing at the bottom, but really nothing to worry about. The Tamron has a much more noticeable green fringing problem at the top and red fringing at the bottom. The Sony 200-600mm provided the worst results overall, with heavy amber fringing at the top and magenta fringing below the area of sharp focus. Rather unsurprisingly, with the lens chart results being so closely fought, when it comes to looking at the real life images I captured, it really is difficult to find fault with any of these lenses. All of the images I captured were tack sharp with bags of contrast and true to life colours, with none of the lenses having any noticeable colour cast issues that ensured that skin tones remained nice and natural straight out of the camera. So at the end of this round, I'm going to give the final point for image quality to the Sony G Master, as this lens is definitely the most optically perfect lens of the bunch. This means that after tallying up all of the scores, the Sony G Master is the winner, with it all coming down to just one crucial point inching it across the finish line. Though despite the Sony G Master taking the crown in this contest, it may not be the best option for everyone for two main reasons. Firstly, it costs significantly more than the other options, and secondly, it is the shortest zoom of the bunch. So in that case, let's assume that you need a lens that has a bit more reach at a lower price point. Which of these runner-ups do you go for? If having the largest focus range possible is key for you, then the Sigma is definitely the one to go for. If you're trying to keep your kit small and lightweight, then go for the Tamron, as it's the smallest and lightest option of these runner-up lenses.